Tonight we are approaching a topic that are somewhat new to us at the Fritt Ord Foundation. And we are overwhelmed to see the interest, to see so many of you. So a warm welcome to everyone. My name is Joachim. I'm a project leader here at the Fritt Ord Foundation. And we started out, we had a project a few years ago where we did events on computer games. And we started out, how can we do something another round? And started out by discussing coverage and review of computer games. Then recently we ran into Jacob Keller, and the topic evolved and became broader. Not only why and how should we discuss computer games, but also a look at a fresh and new forms of cultural journalism. And we are very happy that Jacob Keller could make it all the way from the US, coming here today. Very good. And present your work, Jacob. So that's a very good starting point for the things that we're doing on computer games now. We're also very pleased that you are here, Frida Danmo. You will host us through the event here. You're an expert on engineering. You're an expert on computer games. Good luck. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited for this evening. I think we will have some very good talks and discussions about video games and culture and journalism, something that I'm very of course, very dedicated to and enthusiastic about. But we're, of course, here also today because Jacob Keller is going to present some of his ideas on video games. So just to give you some information about the day, first, he's going to talk a little bit about video games. Then Asbjørn Slettemark will have some comments afterwards. And we're going to have a short break before we start with our panel discussion afterwards. And when that's finished, we get some questions from the audience. So if you have some questions, save them for the end of the show. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Jacob Keller, who's a world-famous video essayist. For me, one of the best within video games essays on the internet. He told me he looks at himself as a writer, most foremost. So the stage is yours. Jacob Keller.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Hi, Oslo. Thank you all so much for coming and seeing me. I'm so excited to be here. I left the United States yesterday afternoon. I got in this morning. I have no idea what time it is. Oh, thank you all for being generous with me. This is actually not the first time that I've been to Oslo or Norway. I was here 8 years ago with on a family trip where my sister graduated high school, and we decided we would go on a trip of Scandinavia. And I bring this up because you have seen a picture of this trip before. So if you have ever seen my profile picture on YouTube, which is me standing in a jacket going like, that was taken in the Narøyfjord. That was 300 kilometers northwest of here. So you have seen me in Norway before. That picture is about 8 years old now, and so I feel a little bit like I'm catfishing people when I come and they see me now. But I have a plan, which is that on Saturday, I'm going back and I have that jacket. And we are going to take the exact same picture, just of me now, and I'm going to replace it on YouTube, and maybe no one else will notice, but all of you will know that I'm here, and when you look at that profile picture, you're seeing me in Norway. Now, my name is Jacob Keller. If you've never heard of me, I really especially appreciate you being here. I am a professional guy who talks about video games. If you know of me, you probably know my YouTube channel, which is also just called Jacob Keller. I've been uploading video essays there for about 6.5 years. I've talked about, at last count, 172 different video games. I've talked about Resident Evil 4 in 7 different video essays, which seems low to me, honestly. And if you've seen me, hopefully you will know that I am mostly a writer and very minorly a public speaker. So forgive me for sticking very closely to the script. I care about the words, and that's why I'm looking at them. If you've seen my work, you will know that games are not my exclusive focus. I've talked about many other things on my channel, works of literature, paintings, theater, a sculpture in the middle of the desert that you're not allowed to take pictures of, a song by the Velvet Underground. When I first started my channel, I assumed that my insistence on talking about non-video game artworks would limit my audience, but this seems to have been the opposite of the case. After 6 years, my channel has over 1 million subscribers. My essays have been viewed 120 million times, and it's my full-time career. I make enough money from this that I can pay for health insurance, which in America is a very important thing to be able to do. Don't applaud for that. It's not a positive. But I want to say that the career that I have now, it didn't come out of nowhere. It's the result of many years of me attempting to be a guy who talks about video games. Before I started my channel, I interned at the video game magazine Game Informer, rest in peace. Before that, I wrote free blogs for a wonderful site and podcast called Cane and Rinse. And before that, I made a YouTube series on all of the things that I had been building in Minecraft. It's called Minecraft Epic Builds, and they are unlisted on YouTube now. But before any of that, before even the Minecraft, I was already making declarations about games. When I was 12, I started experimenting with iMovie on my family's computer. I made rudimentary videos on topics like the best music in video games, or why I should be allowed to have a PlayStation 3. And I never uploaded these videos anywhere. I just watched them over and over and then showed them to my parents. And in retrospect, the most fascinating thing about these videos wasn't their contents, but the sign-off, because I concluded every video very dramatically with giant words filling the screen that said, "Games are art." And this is an unusual phrase for a 12-year-old to fixate on, I think. Games are art, not games are fun or cool or even games are educational. What at 12 did I know about art? I bring this up not to psychoanalyze myself, because I pay someone else to do that. But I think my pre-adolescent fixation on this idea of games and art mirrors a lot of the conversations that we've had and are still having about the place of games in culture. Games are art. We in the industry find ourselves insisting over and over again. Okay, great. I'm saying this to my 12-year-old self. Games are art. So what? I think when I was a kid, one of my primary motivations for repeating this phrase was my desire for games to be viewed as a legitimate pastime. My parents are wonderful people who raised me in a household that valued books and plays and film. We played board games about collecting different paintings, but neither of them were gamers, nor did they really have any experience with the medium. They viewed video games like you might view popcorn, a fun snack, but nutritionally meaningless. And I argued that this was untrue, that video games, just like books or movies or plays, had a depth of intentionality and meaning that made them valuable. I argued that they had just as much to offer. What I didn't realize at the time was how similar my argument was to a larger conversation that had been happening for years. For basically the entire history of the medium, many have argued that video games are frivolous entertainment for children, and others have taken it upon themselves to prove this statement false. It's easy to think that deep readings of video games are a relatively modern phenomenon. Maybe games were silly entertainment for children, but that all changed with the release of Shadow of the Colossus, or Final Fantasy VI, or The Last of Us. This is not the case. For basically as long as video games have been around, writers have insisted on trying to understand their artistic meaning. For instance, More than 40 years ago, a man named David Sudnow wrote a book called Pilgrim in the Micro World, and that was a book based entirely around analyzing one game, Breakout, for the Atari 2600. You know, the game where you bounce the ball against the bricks? It was that. It's an entire book. It's kind of incredible. And as the years went on, more writers would dedicate more words to the idea that games were rich enough texts to merit deep artistic analysis. I've spoken before about one of my favorite examples, a 115-page essay on GameFAQs.com analyzing the game Eco by the writer Peter Elliott. Reading his analysis was revelatory for me. It helped me understand the possibilities of game criticism. When I first argued to my parents that video games were art in the year 2006, I had no idea that there was already so much literature about the same topic. But I have to admit, I also had ulterior motives in arguing how meaningful video games were. Simply put, I wanted my parents to let me play more of them. As high-minded as I'd love to tell you I was as a 12-year-old, the fact was I cared more about playing video games than the meaning of art. Unlike Sudnow or Peter Elliott, people who devoted hundreds of pages of writing to the artistic merit of video games, I mostly saw art as a shortcut to legitimacy. That is, if I could stick the label of art to video games, I could demand that my parents take them seriously. And this, too, was reflective of a large-scale conversation that had been happening about games for years. Simply put, many gamers have had an inferiority complex about our medium since its invention. And I understand why. Gaming is still very young. We don't have the history or the prestige of older art forms. Much of the marketing around games targets children. Much of the content of many video games is juvenile. And because of all these factors, gamers might feel like they have to justify the time spent with games in the ways that readers never have to justify with books. And this makes us feel bad. We don't want to feel like we're spending our lives playing with toys. And so we, as gamers, insist that our pastime is art too. Games are valid, games are mature. But the shallowness of all these arguments, honestly, reminds me of arguing with my parents. It kind of feels like we all just want approval from our moms and dads. Famously, in 2012, legendary American film critic Roger Ebert wrote a blog post about how video games could never be art. This was an enormously contentious piece of criticism, mostly because of the prestige of the person writing it. Ebert is arguably the most well-known cultural critic of the past century. And while I obviously disagree with his thesis, I find myself agreeing with one of his concluding lines. Do they require validation, he writes, in defending their gaming against parents, spouses, children, partners, coworkers, or other critics? Do they want to be able to look up from the screen and explain, I'm studying a great form of art? Ebert had my adolescent self absolutely nailed. I wanted to be free to play as much Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty and Mario Galaxy as I pleased, and I wanted my parents to react by saying, yes, he's studying a great form of art. And Ebert equally had the tone of many in the game industry nailed. We are so desperate for validation. Even today, in response to a particularly beautiful video game, you can find people celebrating how wrong Roger Ebert was about video games. Famously to me, Cliff Bleszinski, lead on the Gears of War series, tweeted this upon Roger Ebert's death. Something eerie about the timing of the loss of Roger Ebert and the release of a true game as art in BioShock Infinite. We just want approval from our film critic dads. If you'll forgive me for further analyzing a decade-old tweet by Cliffy B, what really strikes me about his statement here is the phrase, true game as art. It's revealing about his, and I think a lot of our perspectives on what games being art means. Blazinski is not saying that BioShock Infinite is art because all games are art. He's saying that BioShock Infinite is so good that it achieves becoming art, that it proves something previously unproven. If only, Blazinski wishes, Roger Ebert could have been alive to see Booker DeWitt shoot 1,000 men in the head in a floating city. He would have finally changed his mind about video games. What this implies is that becoming art is a target for games. Maybe there was a time when games weren't capable of being art, but now, if we can make one good enough, it will become art, prove the medium's worth, and silence all that mean-spirited criticism of games. In arguing for video games' artistic worth, gamers typically pull from the same small selection. Shadow of the Colossus is art. Journey is art. Disco Elysium is art. And these are all incredible games, obviously, but Shadow of the Colossus, Journey, and Disco Elysium are also distinctive in how unlike most games they are. Isn't this a strange way to argue that video games are art by choosing a couple games that bear little similarity to most of the medium? There's a two-part fallacy going on in these conversations. Part one is the belief that to become art, something must be particularly good. Part two is the related belief that the specific kind of goodness required for art is a familiar type of beauty, the solemn pathos of Shadow of the Colossus, for instance. Neither of these assertions are true. Thinking about video games as art gets so much easier when you realize that calling something art does not mean you're calling something good. Art is not a goal to be achieved. It's not a signifier of quality. When I call my nephew's scribble art, I am not comparing it in quality to the Mona Lisa, but neither am I denying that the scribble is art. The worst adolescent attempt at a poem is as much art as the best verses of a poet laureate. And in video game terms, Journey is no more or no less art than Breakout. To state it plainly, yes, video games are art. Every one of them, from the most broken student game to the most expensive flagship, from NFT trash to Farming Simulator 2025, each game is a human creation attempting to communicate something to someone. This is not a status I'm awarding games, it is a simple fact of their categorization. Video games are art. So what? Unlike when I first made my arguments for video games as art, I am now an adult. My ability to play games is no longer contingent on approval from my parents, nor am I desperate for powerful people to validate my passion. I don't feel like I have anything to prove about video games, and yet I still approach them as art. In my 2019 essay, Who's Afraid of Modern Art?, I wrote about a number of times that modern art has been attacked either politically or physically by people who felt threatened by its existence. I wrote about Newman's painting, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, Serrano's photograph, Piss Christ, the dozens of artists that the Nazis labeled degenerate, and I also talked about video games, specifically games that were targeted by the hate mob known as Gamergate. My purpose for including games in this essay was to demonstrate that the long-running culture war against non-traditional expressions of art used the same attack tactics irrespective of year or medium. But in that essay, I also wanted to explain the power these pieces of art could have if you let yourself engage with them. I wanted to communicate how I experienced these games as emotional objects, and in writing that script, I intentionally used the same language to describe playing the game Depression Quest as I used to describe standing in front of a massive Rothko painting. I did not do this to equate the quality of these two pieces of art, but my strategies in trying to understand them. Despite their obvious differences in style and design, I could open myself up to them in the same way. I think a problem people who talk about games sometimes have is we assume games are so unique, so new, we have to find entirely new ways to speak about them. And it's true, games present unique challenges for discussion. Movies don't typically have a final boss that can prevent you from seeing the credits. But for all of written history, we have examples of people trying to capture their experience with art in words, and games are just the newest medium to face this same challenge. I've said before, and I will say again, my biggest piece of advice, if you want to write about games, is to read writing that is not about games. Read book reviews, academic journals, historical reflections. You will find the more widely you read, the more games fall in line with the existing history of art. This is the way I use games in my essays, not as a shocking new piece of entertainment that emerged from nowhere, but a medium that is inextricably linked to its historical context. A few years ago, I played a fascinating game called Season, A Letter to the Future. It was a game about capturing the end of the world in photographs. And in writing about the game Season, I found myself turning to other media about the end of the world. Neville Shute's novel On the Beach, Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Because while literally controlling the game may have felt different than reading one of these books, gameplay's mechanics are just a different path to the same goal of expressing a theme. On the Beach's terse, unsympathetic writing communicates the emotional repression of its characters. Season's slow player movement speed and incentivized scrapbooking mechanic creates an atmosphere full of memory and regret. While the methods these pieces of art may use to achieve their themes are different, the goal of communicating the feeling of the end of the world hasn't changed. When you stop viewing games as a totally unique phenomenon, connections like this become obvious. I don't view my comparisons between mediums as a challenge. In fact, I would feel extremely limited if I only had to talk about video games. Games are so obviously inspired and so obviously in conversation with other forms of art that connecting them feels natural. Before starting my channel, I decided that I was going to treat video games as art as an accepted fact. I don't explain how gravity works at the beginning of all my videos, but if you watch them, you would have to assume there was some reason I wasn't floating off the ground. It would be the same with video games as art. Eventually, I hoped my audience would just take it for granted. What I've been pleasantly surprised with is that this tactic, presuming that everyone was on the same page about games being art, has been remarkably effective in converting the non-converted. I can't tell you how many people, generally older adults, have told me that seeing the comparisons I've drawn between games and other forms of art has been eye-opening for them. I finally found a way to convince people that games are art, and all it took was presuming that it had been true all along. The harder pill to swallow for gamers is that, along with the prestige that our favorite hobby, being art, may bring, it comes with a set of responsibilities. If we are to acknowledge that games are art, it means they should be scrutinized with the same methods we apply to other mediums. You know who treated games like art? Anita Sarkeesian. Her series, Tropes versus Women in Video Games, applied basic feminist theory to video games the same way feminist scholars have always done to film, literature, and paintings. She did this in a series of video essays all the way back in 2013, placing her at the very beginning of the format that I've done so much work in. And in response to her giving games the artistic respect we give to every other kind of art, a subset of gamers lost their minds so violently a decade later, they still haven't found them. Some of those people are in charge of the United States government now. Treating games as art means that we can't write off their use of symbolism and imagery as just accidents of making a fun game. Games often revolve around violence and war. Because they are art, we need to ask questions about their use of violence and war. The answer to why are so many games about killing people cannot simply be because, they're video games. That wouldn't be a satisfying answer with any other form of art, and we can't decide that it's satisfying here. Treating games as art means understanding the conditions under which that art is made. Art is made by artists, and artists are people. When we look at the artistic successes and failures of the video game industry, we have a responsibility to learn about the material conditions under which that art was made. How were people treated? How were they paid? Were they thrown aside after their art was released to the public because their continued employment didn't make sense to shareholders? Is the environment created by our institutions one that facilitates the creation of great art, or does it impede it? And even on an individual level, although we understand that games are art, do we return its artistic effort with our own attention? Do we play games like we are, in fact, studying great art? Or do we let them wash over us, abandoning critical thinking in return for short-term drips of dopamine? The worst game has things to say if you're willing to look, and even the greatest piece of art is only as meaningful as our willingness to engage with it. It concerns me, then, that many of the economic efforts of the games industry seem to be designed to discourage this kind of artistic engagement. Although video games are more popular than ever, no stable career exists for video game journalists. Publishers buy the loyalties of streamers and YouTubers. Games are designed to be uncritically consumed and consumed and consumed. Any thoughtful analysis drowned out by never-ending content updates and battle passes. And many consumers, disturbingly, have aligned themselves with capital in this fight, identifying art criticism as the reason for all the problems that they have with the industry. Video games are art. Nothing can change that fact. But games being art does not inherently bestow virtue onto us, the people who play them. In order for video games to enrich our lives, we need to consciously make the decision to engage with them as art. We need to learn about their history and their influences, to search their text and subtext for themes and contradictions. When I first declared at age 12 that games are art, I didn't realize the responsibility I was giving myself. And now, I want to give that responsibility to all of you. Games are art? Yes, sure. Prove it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I've also been on the side of talking about how video games are art without necessarily thinking about how much that actually entails.
Right.
I want to ask you, because recently I heard someone say that we've forgotten to talk about how games are fun. And I know we kind of sometimes talk about games being art, and then there's games that are it's just entertainment. We kind of separate those kind of things.
I think it goes back to what I spoke about of us having a very particular vision of what art is. That is, art is Shadow of the Colossus. Art is a very solemn game where you experience sadness and regret and whatever. And we know that being fun is also an art in itself, and we have all played games that succeed wildly at being fun and games that fail at being fun, and you can understand in that success and failure that there is an artistry to making something fun. But I think it's almost harder to talk about because sadness and seriousness and, morbid themes are very clearly art. And fun seems to almost run closer to that idea of games are for kids that we're so scared of and we want to stay away from. And so I think it's really interesting that talking about fun as art is almost a greater challenge than talking about, the very serious themes that some games can have.
Hopefully we'll be able to actually talk about how artful games can also be fun and not be ashamed for the entertainment value of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also want to ask you how long you think it will take before games are looked upon as culture on the same line as books and movies and that kind of thing. School kids are taught that they need to read books because that's good for them, and movies that's good for them. Do you think we'll ever get to the point where video games are more sidelined there?
I think whenever you see the introduction of a new entertainment medium, you see the wave of people saying, this is rotting kids' brains, it's bad, everything else was good. People certainly said that about movies when they first emerged, about the radio, about board games. And so I think we have a natural kind of reactionary impulse of saying this new thing is dangerous, it's bad. This old thing clearly has a lot of history and prestige, it's good. I think a lot of it will be, as we were talking about before we got up here, just people who have grown up playing games, having kids of their own, knowing, like the enrichment that they found from games and whatnot. But I also think that there is kind of an institutional prestige that games are lacking. That we know that there are art museums where you can go see paintings, and there are even film museums, and there are film festivals and all of that. And games, and this is kind of where I don't know who to blame. The equivalent of a film festival for video games is a press conference where you watch 30 ads in a row, and I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors by making that kind of our highest point of cultural visibility. And so I think a lot of it is just aging into something that's been known for a long time. But I also think that we need to figure out how to make public these sorts of deep analytical conversations we're having about games, because right now all you kind of see is the selling of them, which is not particularly conducive to talking about them as art.
Oh, that's interesting, with the fact that the culture is kind of being created in the middle of commercialism.
Yes.
Yeah. I realized that we talked a little bit about it before we came up here, the fact that we're not very good at taking care of preserving games.
Yeah.
And now, since you've talked about art museums and everything, we've been quite good at keeping paintings for hundreds of years. How would video games end up in that scale?
It's a real challenge, and I think it's fascinating to hear video game historians talk about them, because on one hand there is just the physical requirements of it, that if you have an NES to play cartridges on, that just breaks down over time. That keeping the machine working is challenging, and then you can save a ROM of that game, maybe, if it's legal, which video game publishers are often very against. But even then, when you play that game on an emulator with a controller other than what it was designed for, that is also experiencing something different than the game as it came out. We are not seeing paintings with the same eyes that people saw at the time, where we all kind of have the benefit of historical looking back. But with games, it's particularly difficult, especially when literally the way that TVs look has changed. And so you can't see what something looked like on a CRT unless you're playing it there. My friend and colleague, Kelsey Lewin, who's done a lot of work with video game history, has talked about how, yes, you could preserve every patch of World of Warcraft, and you could go back to kind of an empty world and see, okay, what do the skills look like here? But she said, the famous viral video Leroy Jenkins teaches us more about what World of Warcraft was at that time than actually going back and playing it. And so I think a lot of the kind of, we don't think of it as such, but Let's Plays and podcast conversations and other ways of talking about video games in their specific moment is also really important to kind of preserve how people reacted to them at the time. And it is this this conversation that's important, not just the game in isolation.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk to you about a topic that comes up in your videos, not just video games being art, but a lot of your videos are based on fear. So what is it about fear and the representation of fear in fiction and media that is so fascinating to you?
I mean, I think it is. I love talking about fear, because a lot of what I'm doing with any talking about art is kind of identifying that the art creates a feeling and then working backward to figure out why. That this game makes me feel nostalgic. Why is that? this and this and this. And fear is an emotion that we feel so immediately with so little introspection. You know, like you don't look at something and think through all the reasons that it's scary and decide that you're afraid. It just happens immediately. And so for me, it's just such an interesting experience to kind of break apart the concept of fear in that way. I've talked a lot about some of my favorite horror works are works where if you describe them out loud, they don't sound scary, but experiencing them, it just is, and identifying like, okay, what are they doing with tone and pacing and context and whatever to create that when none of this sounds like it should be activating, my like deep-seated emotional response.
I work with video games and or video in general, and my medium is video. So of course your work is inspiring to me. So my question to you is, what is your sources of inspiration? What inspires you in your work?
I mean, I certainly, before I started my YouTube channel, it was other people working on YouTube, old channels at this point. But Noah Caldwell-Gervais, many people here probably know, Innuendo Studios, Errant Signal were all people that I looked up to. But in kind of honing my own voice and trying to figure out what I want to be doing, I look at other mediums just as much. The writings of Robert McFarlane I've talked about before, who's a nature writer, but seems to have kind of read everything and consumed, every possible connection to the nature that he's writing about. Or, the work of Ira Glass on the American podcast, This American Life, is another kind of source of like, it's just telling a story in such a clear and emotionally concise way that like that is, they're not making videos, but they are finding ways to communicate stories in ways that I find enormously compelling, and that's kind of who I try to draw inspiration from.
When it comes to like telling stories and making connections to make the story make sense, have you had an idea for a video essay or a written text that you wanted to make, but you just couldn't make the connections go up and make it the whole story that you always wanted to make, but it just didn't add up?
I have so many kind of like notes in my phone of just like two ideas that I've put next to each other, and I'm like, one day I'll find a third, and then that will be a video. And for a long time, that was, if you've seen my recent video, Fear of Dark, it has a whole section on people who are like burning all of their possessions to stay in the light. And for years, I had, two things written down, and then I finally found the third thing, and I was like, oh my gosh, now this is not just a connection, it's a pattern, and I can talk about it. And so if I pulled out my phone, I could show you, it's like driving a car in the dark, and it just has like two random things written down, but someday that will have a third, and then it'll become really interesting.
Have you ever had a time where you kind of found the third and started working on it, and then realized this is the worst thing you've ever written, and realized it's just threw it away kind of thing?
It's always, I think about, like, I'm kind of rolling my video ideas around in my head for oftentimes like months before I actually start writing. And so by the time I get to the writing phase, if I haven't got bored of thinking about it, I know that like there's enough there. It just happens that if the idea doesn't have enough juice to become a video, it just doesn't even stick with me, and it's when I find myself thinking about things in the shower or something that I'm like, that's it. That's gold.
Yeah, good things come from enthusiasm.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for our little talk here and for your presentation. You will join us later for the panel discussion, but right now, thank you so much, and a large applause for Jacob Gelle.
Thank you, everyone.